cuneiform writing system is among the most important cultural contributions of Mesopotamian society. The number of cuneiform documents surviving from the early dynastic period, the time of the earliest city-states, from around 2900 to 2350 BCE, is relatively small. More survive from the time of the Akkadian Empire and the second dynasty of Lagash, which followed. But when we come to the next major era of Mesopotamian history, the documentation positively explodes. This was a period when Mesopotamia was dominated by a dynasty that ruled from the city of Ur in the southern part of modern-day Iraq. It's known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, the Ur-3 period for short. And it lasted a little more than a century, from around 2112 to 2004 BCE. Not many of these cuneiform texts record poems or hymns or myths. Instead, most are administrative. A huge number of them come from the Ur-3 period. And studied as a large group, these documents reveal amazing details about the economy and administration of the era. In fact, more than 120,000 cuneiform tablets written during the time are estimated to have been found so far. And they're housed all over the place. One study discovered that 545 different collections, museums, and libraries around the world have tablets from the Ur-3 period. A lot of them were sold on the antiquities market over the past 150 years or so. I learned to read the ancient languages in graduate school, and I use cuneiform in my research. Several times during my career, I've been asked by a curator of a small museum or by a librarian if I'd look at a cuneiform tablet in their collection to see what it says. In just about every case, the tablet turns out to be from the Ur-3 period. And like almost all of these tablets, it records some commodities received by a temple or palace, or delivered to an individual or an institution, or it records payments made to workers. The tablets were drawn up every day, apparently in every palace and temple and government office in the Ur-3 kingdom. And they listed the receipt and distribution of individual items. Where did the goods come from? Where were they going to be sent? Who were they being given to? What was the date when this happened? Who oversaw it? All this information was meticulously recorded on small tablets that were stored together. Here's a typical example of a transaction. It uses the standard measurements of the time, barig, ban, and sila. 2 barig, 2 ban, 2 sila of clarified butter, 3 barig of cheese, deficit of the herdsman or kanara. After the individual transaction records were created, the information was combined into big ledgers. This usually happened once a month. None of these tablets was intended to survive. The scribes didn't write them thinking about how people in the future might view them. They were purely functional, yet they did survive. It's as though a bunch of individual W-2 forms in an accountant's office were to survive for 4,000 years, and future historians tried to reconstruct the modern world based on those forms. You can imagine the kinds of things they would observe. So, this person was paid some amount for working at a particular company. This other person was paid more. This is how much they paid in taxes. This is who oversaw their work. A future historian would have lots of questions. What lies behind those names? What were their working conditions? What did they care about? There's so much missing. That's true for the Ur-3 texts as well. What we do know is that thousands and thousands of men and women worked for different aspects of the central and provincial administrations in some way or another. They worked in the military, or as builders, farmers, herdsmen, religious functionaries, officials, scribes, artisans, or servants. Each province in the kingdom paid taxes to the central government, but the provinces didn't all owe their taxes on the same day. In Mesopotamia, there was no equivalent of the April 15th deadline. Instead, each province was responsible for paying during a particular month. These taxes supported the government for that month. In the next month, it was the turn of another province. This meant that wealth was coming in year-round. Taxes were paid in goods, not in silver. So the administration built a whole town to cope with the goods coming in and the goods going out. It was called Puzrish Dagan and was close to the religious capital city of Nippur. A huge number of tablets survived from the main offices there. Boats were constantly being unloaded, herds of animals shepherded around, granaries were being filled and emptied. Every item that arrived or left Puzrish Dagan was recorded, and these records were filed and later compiled. Scholars used to think the Ur-3 period was a time of tyrannical kings who controlled every aspect of the economy. They reasoned that if every single goat and cow had to be accounted for among the huge herds of animals that passed through Puzrish Dagan and every other town, then some megalomaniac, a very successful megalomaniac, must have been behind this process. But contemporary scholars have revised this view. Although the third dynasty of Ur was a time when a lot of changes took place, the kings didn't rule with an iron hand. They had to work within an existing system that included powerful temples and governors with whom the king's administration negotiated. The first king of the Ur-3 dynasty was named Ur-Nammu. He and his son Shulgi built an empire. It was the first one since the Akkadian Empire, which had been built by King Sargon in the 24th century BCE. Ur-Nammu and Shulgi took over much of southern and central Mesopotamia and extended the borders of their land to the region around the ancient city of Susa in what is now western Iran. But scholars disagree about how successful the Ur-3 dynasty rulers were in controlling their empire. Shulgi certainly spent a lot of time on campaign during his reign, but not necessarily conquering new lands. He might have been trying to retain control of existing domains that were constantly trying to leave the empire. Mesopotamia wasn't easily unified, and each aspiring emperor had difficulties in maintaining control of the lands he conquered. Ur-3 kings didn't boast about territorial conquests, and in this, they were nothing like King Sargon. Instead, the Ur-3 kings claimed that they liberated the lands they took over. They adopted a tone in their inscriptions that was more like some of the kings of Lagash from the early dynastic period, or like the more recent king Gudea, who'd ruled Lagash from around 2144 to 2124 BCE. The ruler's main goal, they said, was to protect the weak people in society from strong individuals and institutions that might exploit them or hurt them. So the kings didn't want to be seen as fierce tyrants. They were kind shepherds. They promoted this image by creating a new kind of royal inscription that was probably displayed in public. It's usually called a law code in history books, but it wasn't called a law code when it was first created. It started with a prologue, all about King Ur-Nammu and his great achievements. The statement ended this way: I did not deliver the orphan to the rich. I did not deliver the widow to the mighty. I did not deliver the man with but 1 shekel to the man with 1 mina, that is 60 shekels. I eliminated enmity, violence, and cries for justice. I established justice in the land. What the king emphasized here was how good he was to his people. Then he added a new type of statement to the inscription. Immediately after the prologue, he wrote, "At that time, if a man commits a homicide, they shall kill that man." And a few lines later, if a man divorces his first-ranking wife, he shall weigh and deliver 60 shekels of silver. These obviously are laws. They're phrased in the same way as most of the laws in the Bible. If someone does a particular thing, then this or that punishment or fine will be imposed. But when Ur-Nammu's inscription was written, it might not have been obvious that the statements constituted laws. They seem instead to have been listed as concrete examples of how Ur-Nammu was going to protect his people and establish justice. There's nothing in the inscription to say the rules had to be followed by judges in court. Today, Ur-Nammu is often considered to be the man who invented laws. But these laws don't ever seem to have been copied individually in ancient times. And they didn't ever appear without the prologue. So the inscription seems to have been thought of as a whole unit, not as a collection of laws that could be quoted and analysed separately. The laws were part of the king's proclamation as to how he would rule and why his subjects should trust him. They weren't used like a modern law code at all. The king needed his people's support, and they benefited from the order he brought to their lives, as reflected in these clauses. Rather than being rules to be enforced, they were probably legal precedents based on past court cases. The courts had already existed for centuries before this proclamation and functioned well without the need for written laws. And so, rather than directly consult the king's decrees, the judges continued to decide cases based on the evidence and on past precedents. The Ur-3 kings also tried other new things to claim their legitimate right to rule, without terrorizing the population as the Akkadian kings had done. It's during this period that a compilation of the names of kings and the cities they ruled, going back to the beginning of civilization, seems to have been written. This is the Sumerian king list. But it isn't historically accurate. It presents an idealized past in which Mesopotamia was always unified, with kingship over the land passing smoothly from one city to another, and with each in turn becoming capital of the whole land. This wasn't true, of course. For most of history, the land had been divided into small kingdoms and city-states that warred with one another. Still, the ideal of unity was useful. If people believed it was normal for all of Mesopotamia to be ruled by one dynasty, then they'd be less likely to rebel against the Ur-3 kings who really had unified the land under their rule. Ur-Nammu boasts in the prologue to his laws that he standardized weights and measures. This was another way to promote order and unity across the land and to make sure the kingdom ran smoothly. At the time, it seems, all the Mesopotamian cities already used shekels and minas to weigh things. There were 60 shekels in a mina, and a mina weighed about 1 pound. But the minas weren't uniform. A mina in one city might weigh slightly more than a mina in another city. The temples kept standard sets of weights and measures, but until this time they had applied to only one particular region. You can see why Ur-Nammu and Shulgi would want the same standards to apply everywhere. If people were paying taxes, and they had different conceptions of what, say, a mina or a shekel was, or what constituted a bushel of barley, then what arrived at the palace as payment might be less than expected. Trade would also be easier if everyone had the same set of weights and measures. You wouldn't need to keep converting from one standard to another. The kings also attempted to create a single calendar to be used everywhere in the kingdom. At that time, years weren't numbered. Instead, each year was named for a significant achievement by the king. Since many documents were dated, the year names provided the subjects with a constant reminder of the king's greatness. Some year names referred to a king's pious works for the gods, like appointing priests or priestesses, or restoring temples. Other year names mentioned marriages between the king's daughters and other rulers. And there were year names about building city walls. But a lot of them were about conquests of cities. They show that the Ur-3 kings were more warlike than their other inscriptions would have us believe. In their drive to standardize things, the central administration even seems to have unified building techniques. There were standardized types and sizes of bricks and innovations in the construction of public buildings. The builders started baking bricks for the exterior walls instead of just drying them in the sun. And they added strategic holes in the structures to allow the interior bricks, which were sun-dried, to continue to dry out even after the building was constructed. The kings sponsored the construction of huge pyramid-shaped temple towers in many of the cities. These were called ziggurats, and they were constructed next to the great temples of the gods. Each ziggurat was a solid mass of brick built in 4 or 5 giant steps, probably with a small shrine on the top. They were built on a scale that had never been seen before in Mesopotamia. The ziggurat at the capital city of Ur was particularly magnificent. It was maybe 100 feet tall, and its base measured 210 feet by 148 feet. The lower level was reconstructed recently in the 20th century, and it gives you a sense of the huge scale of the operation. It's been estimated that 1,000 men would have to have worked for almost 5 months straight to deliver and place the bricks for just the first stage of the Ur ziggurat. These hundreds of builders were supported by brickmakers, rope makers, cooks, water carriers, physicians, a whole community, and all of these people had to be fed and housed by the administration. It was a colossal undertaking. The ziggurats going up all over the kingdom must have made a huge impression on the people. The landscape in southern Mesopotamia is absolutely flat. Only the occupation mounds where the cities were located would have risen above the flat plain. You'd have seen them from far away as you walked along the roads or sailed on the rivers or canals. The cities would stand out on the horizon. And now, these big stepped temple towers rose up in the center like artificial mountains, testifying to the power of the king and proving his love for the gods, and showing off the organization of his administration. The kings also commissioned royal tombs near the temples. These were dug underground, with steps leading down into the rooms with vaulted ceilings. Unfortunately, the tombs were robbed long ago, but archaeologists have found the remains of gold leaf, lapis lazuli, and agate. These remnants reveal that the walls would have been covered with gold and semi-precious stones, and the ceilings were painted with stars. The tombs would have been spectacular houses for the kings to live in after death. In trying to convince the population to support them, the Ur-3 kings reinstituted an idea that had begun with Sargon's grandson, King Naram-Sin of Akkad. Starting with King Shulgi, rulers had scribes write a divine symbol in front of their names because they wanted to be viewed as gods. They even claimed to have superhuman powers. Shulgi had a hymn composed in his honor that is sometimes called the King of the Road. In it, he mentions 2 festivals that took place on the same day, one in the city of Ur and the other in Nippur. The divine king decided to celebrate both by running from one city to the other and back in a single day. This was a distance of 100 miles, that's 200 miles round trip, so the feat simply was not possible. Besides which, King Shulgi described a huge hailstorm that blew in as he ran. Being divine, of course, he claimed that he achieved his goal and made it to Nippur and back, celebrating both festivals on the same day with no problem. Scribes studied and copied this hymn in school, along with others like it. 48 such royal poems have been found, all extolling the greatness of the Ur-3 kings. The kings also wanted to show how pious they were, and that they were loved and chosen by the gods. A new image that shows up on steles and cylinder seals at this time is known as the presentation scene. In it, a god or goddess is seated on a throne, with the king standing in front and another minor goddess leading him or standing behind him. The king is shown praying to the god or pouring a libation to the deity. Sometimes the god is depicted handing a rod and a ring to the king. These were the symbols of authority and power. Even though the Ur-3 kings were supposed to be divine, they still had to work with all the other parts of government and society to make things run smoothly. They didn't simply proclaim things and assume they would be done. Mesopotamia didn't work that way. You can think of Mesopotamia at this time as a conglomeration of households. At the family level, the household is easy to conceive of. A typical Mesopotamian household consisted of a married couple and their children living together. With them were elderly relatives, along with unmarried aunts and maybe some servants. The oldest male relative, the grandfather or father of the family, was head of the household. But the house was an economic unit, not just a social one. If the family owned fields or animals, then those provided food. If the family was involved in some other profession, as artisans or scribes or merchants, then the work was often performed in the home. Even officials who worked for the court seem to have done at least some of their work at home rather than in an office at the palace. The term for house in Sumerian is so each house was thought of as the of the patriarch. Every temple was also an These temples all had names and each started with the word house. So the temple of the moon god at Ur was the Shurgal, the house of the great light. The temple of the great god Enlil at Nippur was the Ekur, or mountain house. The temple of the goddess Inanna at Uruk was the Eanna, or house of heaven. And the temples weren't only houses for the gods. They also had households with dependents and land and herds of animals. These could represent immense resources. The head of the temple household was the high priest or priestess. Some religious leaders were appointed by the king, but not all. So the king had to negotiate with the temple households, which controlled a great deal of the wealth of the kingdom. Governors of provinces were also patriarchs of their own households, their palaces and the estates. The word for palace in Sumerian was gal, great house. A governor had considerable autonomy in ruling his province and was perceived as the father of his giant household. We see this, for example, in texts from the city of Umma, which had been a long-time rival of the city of Lagash in previous centuries. About 15,000 cuneiform tablets from the Ur-3 period were found in Umma, and the majority of them record the administrative dealings of the governor's household. Scholars learn from examining these tablets that the governor had authority over almost everything in his province, including the temple. He also controlled a lot of offices that oversaw almost all aspects of the economy. He administered offices for specific products, such as leather, wool, animals, and grain. And there were offices of agriculture, boats, and labor. A fiscal office coordinated it all, keeping track of taxes and payments. It was a very orderly system. Imagine dozens of officials and scribes employed in a hierarchical system, paying attention to all the food produced, all the objects manufactured, all the people employed, all the boats commissioned, all the buildings constructed, and recording it meticulously so nothing got lost, no payment was missed. Although the great kings of the Ur-3 dynasty ruled over Umma and received taxes from the province, their names aren't mentioned much in the documents found there. One of the only places the names of the kings show up is in the dates on the texts, because the years were named for the king's great achievements. The kings also controlled the military, but even the soldiers were overseen by local generals from Umma. So the evidence from Umma has shown that the kingdom of the third dynasty of Ur was nothing like as centralized as scholars used to think. The provinces paid their taxes to the king, but they had a lot of autonomy. Holding a lot of this economy together in an interesting way was a group of merchants. At Umma, there were at least 20 of them during the Ur-3 period. They worked directly for the governor's administration. Some of what they did is pretty much what you would expect of a merchant. They traveled and acquired valuable goods in distant lands and brought them back to Umma. But they also had other important responsibilities. One is that they seem to have been in charge of collecting and processing fruits, vegetables, and fish for the governor. In the hot climate of southern Mesopotamia, without refrigeration, these foodstuffs would have gone bad very quickly. It seems that merchants were particularly adept at getting perishables from the farm or the river to the consumer as fast as possible. The merchants were also willing to make loans to private individuals. Banking hadn't been invented, but people sometimes needed to borrow grain to sow their crops or to borrow silver to buy something. Merchants had extra grain and silver on hand and could fill this need. One merchant who lived in Ur towards the end of the Ur-3 period was named Lu-Enlil. He was employed by the temple of the moon god and regularly traveled by boat all the way to Magan, which is now Oman, to buy copper. This was a well-established trade route, and he took wool and textiles to pay for the metal. Mesopotamian kingdoms had been getting copper from Oman for a long time, but in the Ur-III period, a merchant like Lu-Enlila worked directly for the temple, one of those great households. The land of Magan might also have been a diplomatic partner of the kings of Ur. Until the Ur-III period, the exchange of envoys and peace treaties, dynastic marriages and diplomatic correspondence seemed to have taken place only among states within Mesopotamia and Syria. But King Shulgi received a gift of gold dust from the king of Magan, according to an administrative text. Luxury gifts were often a sign of diplomacy. Another clue is found in a slightly later text mentioning the arrival of someone named Wedum, who is described as the courier of the governor of Magan. So perhaps the king of Magan sent envoys regularly to Ur with expensive gifts, and perhaps even letters. The Ur kings had close contacts with the lands to the east of Mesopotamia. They directly controlled the city of Susa and had diplomatic ties with other population centers in the same general area of Elam in southwestern Iran. The names of Elamite envoys show up in the administrative texts. They received gifts and attended important festivals. Also, princesses from Ur were sent to marry Elamite kings to cement the alliances. As you can imagine, the city of Ur must have been a pretty cosmopolitan place. Envoys, merchants, and other visitors from distant lands were not an uncommon sight on the streets. In one text, it sounds as though there might even have been South Asians who lived together and worked alongside native Mesopotamians. They're described as men from a Meluha village. Meluha was the Indus Valley. So in addition to hearing Elamites spoken as you walked around Ur, you would probably also hear the languages of Magan and Meluha, along with the local languages of Sumerian and Akkadian. And there probably would have been another language heard on the streets, Amorite. It was spoken by people from lands to the west and north. Throughout the Ur-III period, immigrants from this region settled in Mesopotamia. They were referred to as the Martu, or Westerners, or as the Tidnum, and their language was Semitic, similar to Akkadian, but also closely related to later West Semitic languages, like Arabic and Hebrew. So the Ur-III kings tried a different approach to running their empire than had been seen before. The extended household economy flourished and was well organized and effective. In addition, the Ur-III rulers created something of a cult of the kings. They emphasized their greatness and encouraged people to believe that the kings were on their side. Even in modern times, there's been a tendency to see Shulgi as one of the great kings of Mesopotamian history. But as it turned out, the empire lasted for little more than a century. And the Ur-III kings might have achieved less than they would have had us believe, because in the end, they had trouble holding on to their empire.